My journey began in humanitarian work when I was working as a young professional. I learned a lot about the pain and suffering in a humanitarian crisis. Everybody is responsible. So I think that comes from the innate decency that's in people. Well, an interesting point is I myself personally have never been in the Ukraine.
With me is Father Gerry O'Connor, Redemptorist from Ireland, who for many years has led solidarity projects for Redemptorists in Africa and recently joined the relief effort in Ukraine. Father Gerry, how did it happen that you got involved in organizing humanitarian help for Ukraine?
Well, thank you for interviewing me and inviting me into your beautiful studio here with Scala News. It's my first time to be interviewed here at Scala News. So my journey began in humanitarian work when I was working as a young professional person in the finance sector, and an opportunity came up to volunteer to go to Sudan. And in Sudan, there was a really brutal civil war and a famine. And so I went and worked in South Sudan. This is before I joined the Redemptorist congregation, and I became immersed in the terrible humanitarian crisis there. And that's what gave me my first experience. And thereafterwards, even as a Redemptorist student, wherever there was an emergency, Somalia, Rwanda during the genocide, I would go and work in those regions and zones. So I learned a lot about the pain and suffering in a humanitarian crisis and about how to respond, how to get other people interested, how to get funding, and how to really deliver effective aid and assistance to those who are troubled and suffering.
Mm-hmm. And what about the Ukraine? How did you got the notice on your decision moment that you are, okay, I'm going to do something for this in this situation?
Well, an interesting point is I myself personally have never been in the Ukraine. I know Africa exceptionally well. However, we in Ireland, I'm a Redemptorist from the Dublin province of Ireland, and in our community in Limerick, over many years we have welcomed Redemptorist students from Ukraine to learn English. So that began a connection, a relationship. And so therefore, as we were watching the news reports that war was likely to happen, I began to imagine what's it going to be like for those Ukrainian Redemptorists that I had met. So I began to really follow all the news reports, and I became very concerned that this would be a cruel and brutal war. I have some knowledge of the war in Syria and how Russia fights battles and wars and sometimes forgets that even there are some rules even in war. So I became very concerned and full of anxiety. I did a little bit of research about the Redemptorists in Ukraine. I began to write to the provincial. I wrote to the units around Ukraine, Poland and Slovakia, to the missionary sisters of the Redemptorists. I just wrote to them and said, I'm in Ireland, I'm a Redemptorist confrere. If I can help, I will help. And I sent them a little document called a Memorandum of Understanding between the Dublin province and the province of Lviv, the province in Warsaw in Poland, and the same with the sisters, to say, let's try to work together on this. So that was the first initiative I took. The second was that I wrote a press release for the newspapers, the radio stations in Ireland, and I sent it out to each Redemptorist superior, and I said, if you would like to help the people of Ukraine, this was in the first days, and you would like to invite your people in the parish, the friends of the Redemptorists, then this is a statement to tell you a little bit about the Redemptorists in Ukraine and what their work is and how they are now planning to respond to the crisis. And so some of the superiors immediately sent that. One superior said to me, thank you, Gerry, this is what I needed. He sent it to his local radio station, the local newspapers, and then they began to interview Redemptorists.
What was the response?
The response after the interviews was that they felt that the Redemptorists have a presence, that they're in the ground. There are 9 locations around Ukraine. So therefore, the Redemptorists sound like people we can trust to bring assistance and help and support to those that are fleeing. At that time, the families were fleeing their homes. So therefore, people like when they know there are people who are already on the ground, close to the people working. And so people started contributing money then. So that was the first thing. I contacted the Ukraine and said, how can we send money? I contacted Poland. And then there were people who started telephoning and saying, we would like to send gifts that we have, supplies that we have. The provincial of Lviv sent me every Monday morning a list of all the essential items for those families that were fleeing. Sometimes it was something like socks, sometimes it was food that was required. And then also because people were getting injured in the war, sometimes it was specific medical supplies. So we started to get a plan together to respond to what was been identified as the big needs. And this was a very international response because, as you know, Poland is alongside Ukraine. We're in Ireland. So by talking every day to the provincial of Poland, we worked out a way to bring the supplies into the Ukraine. So we could send a truckload of supplies from Ireland to Leżajsk in Poland, and then they would be brought across in a convoy which Caritas, that wonderful church organisation, charitable organisation, was leading. And we had to make sure that every time that we put down the address, the name of the Redemptorist provincial and phone number, so whether it was a box of medicine or a box of clothes, so that when it was delivered to a seminary just outside Lviv, he would get a phone call and then he could go and pick up the items and make sure that they went to 9 different locations in the Ukraine.
You mentioned that it was shortly was apparent that it needed be the international cooperation. What is your experience in that field, in international cooperation?
Well, I think one of the blessings in being a Redemptorist is that I think we're in maybe 70, 80 countries around the world, and we can quickly get in contact with each other. We have a book with addresses, telephone numbers. So immediately that international Redemptorist family were talking to each other. So that meant we were able to respond very well. So I have had an excellent experience of working with the provincial of Poland and one of his students around how to get supplies into Poland. There's a young German volunteer called Andres. He's from Bonn. He volunteered under the Redemptorist International Volunteering Programme for a year in Ireland, and he worked with me in Dublin. He's very involved in the Order of Malta, delivering first aid to people who are in need in Germany. So I just telephoned him and said, Andres, do you know how we will get very good first aid medical kits in Germany so that we can get them to the Ukraine? So he talked to some people, he did some research, and now every day he works with me. By WhatsApp call, he identifies places in Germany where we can get emergency first aid kits, all sorts of specialized medical equipment. And sometimes they're donated, but very often we have to buy them. And then we get them transported to Poland by DHL. They're insured. There's a Redemptorist student called Dominic in Tukov. I know I haven't pronounced that town. What's the correct pronunciation, Gregory? Tuhu. Yes, and Dominic confirms the arrival of the supplies and then tells us when they leave there to go to Ukraine, and then we get a message confirming that the specialized medical equipment has arrived. Often we get photographs. So through WhatsApp, we have a WhatsApp group which helps us have certainty that Redemptorist aid is reaching people in Ukraine.
Does the solidarity only become apparent in crisis situation? What is your experience?
Well, I'm Irish. We had a famine, and it's still in our memory. And people from around the world came to our assistance when our people were hungry. We've had a wonderful history of sending missionaries all over the world, and they've come back with their stories. And so most Irish families will have had a relation, an uncle, an aunt, a granduncle that worked in Africa or Asia or South America. And as a result, I think Irish people are often very alert to what's going on around the world, and their hearts are moved. The rich understanding of the word solidarity in the Catholic tradition is that everybody is responsible we're all neighbours. We live in a global world. We are connected by our humanity, and therefore there is a very strong sense that when there is a crisis that we should reach out and respond, and the Irish public does that. It also does it for problems at home and difficulties. There are some crises that touch the hearts more than others. I remember the crisis in Haiti. People were very troubled by what they saw, how so many children died with schools falling. The same when there was the typhoon in the Philippines. And the Ukraine, because we were getting messages, we now live in a world where propaganda couldn't stop the people of Ukraine from being able to tell their story. So people were listening. They were able to imagine, what would this be like if it were my family that had to flee overnight? And I think they wanted to do everything humanly possible to say, we care for you, we want to reach out to you. So I think that comes from the innate decency that's in people. Of course, there is some evidence that neighbours don't know each other, communities aren't as strong as they were in the past. The digital world, actually, though it makes us have contact, we've become more distant from each. So like any other country, that's all there. But essentially, human beings do have hearts. And if the story is told fairly to them, I think they respond with love, with care, with compassion, with conviction and generosity.
Do you have any special recipe to invite the people to get involved?
I think first of all, invite people. So it's always good when you have a story to share, when you have information. And this is very important for charities and religious groups, that if you're able to tell your story, and I think this is what we experienced in Ireland, because we made contact with our Redemptorist brothers in Ukraine. They told us what was happening. We used every modern media to tell the Irish people what was happening. And then we were able to say, look, if you want to help, this is what we can do. And in helping, I think it's not just enough to ask. You also must give people feedback. Tell them, where did their donation go? Where did the money go? If you have good images, photographs, share them. And most importantly, try to make sure that what you are organising in your home country is what the people need, what's wanted. And this is what I found hugely helpful, is that the provincial of the Redemptorists in the Ukraine sent me a list every Monday with what was most required and needed. And then our job was to organise that. And when you were able to say to somebody, no, they don't need this, they need the following, they really responded, because they had a sense then that their efforts were going to be purposeful, that it would really help those that were most in need. I don't know, you probably don't watch Irish television, but there was a truckload of aid that came, and a local Ukrainian man pointed out that in the aid was a pair of pink shoes with high heels, and he held it up and said, this is not what we want. So when you're sending humanitarian assistance, always ask the people who are going to receive it, what is it that you really need? Because that's true partnership. And that's how you, I think, give credibility to humanitarian work, where you're not just deciding you know best for the people who need the aid. You're talking to them, you're listening to them, and together you're working to make sure that those that are most impacted by war or hunger or poverty, that they are really helped.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Gerry,
Pleasure to be with you.
This.